Hey guys, check it out. This is the Honda Super Cub, and in this video we are going over all the cool gadgets and gizmos that make it so neat. Now, full disclosure, I am by no means a motorcycle expert. I actually just got my motorcycle endorsement last week. So if you want to see a full comprehensive review, stay tuned here to TFL Bike, because Case is going to have that coming up real soon. But in this video, I just want to show you some of the really cool things on this little bike. This Honda is the best-selling motorized vehicle on the planet. They have sold over 100 million Super Cubs since its introduction way back in 1958. And quite honestly, if you look at a Super Cub from the 60s or the 70s, it looks almost identical to this machine. However, it left the United States for a number of years. It came back in 2019, and this is the latest version. Now, there were a number of requirements that went into designing the Super Cub way back in the 1950s. One of the most interesting is you had to be able to carry your soba noodles if you were a delivery rider, and as such, there's no clutch lever on this little bike. In order for Honda to get around not having a hand clutch, they had to get a little bit creative. Now, modern day scooters typically have a CVT, but the Super Cub has a semi-automatic, so you still shift gears, but rather than using a clutch, you just let off the throttle, you shift gears up and down, and then a centrifugal clutch does the rest for you. It's a super easy mechanism, and it's actually really pretty intuitive. So neutral is all the way down, so you push down on this little front lever, and then rather than pulling up with the top of your shoe, you actually push backwards to go up a gear. So neutral all the way down, then first, second, third, and fourth. Now, the rest of the controls are pretty similar to not a scooter but a motorcycle. So up here on the handlebar, you still have a front brake, your twist throttle, but then your rear brake is actually actuated down here on your right foot. The Honda uses a 124.9 cc single cylinder, all right, 125. Now, it is an air-cooled engine, and one of the design requirements of the Hondas way back in the day is they had to be super quiet. Let's see if you think this new Super Cub is just as quiet as you'd expect. Now, this 125 is actually the same engine found in the Honda Grom, the Honda Monkey, the Super Cub, of course, and the upcoming Honda Trail. How cool is that? It's also fuel injected, which is great when you live up here at 6,000 feet of elevation. That's another thing this bike does. It just beeps constantly to let you know the key's in range or the key is out of range. It's a little bit annoying. Now, even though this looks like an old school bike, they did bring in some pretty serious tech, including the Honda Smart Key, which is very similar to what you'd find in like a modern day car with push button start. So you don't actually insert the key into a slot on the side of the scooter. Instead, it works just like a car. So you put it in your pocket, and now you can operate all the controls on the bike just by having the key within range. So this right here is the ignition switch. It has a couple of positions. There's off, there's on, and clearly I'm too far out of range here. Let me bring my key a little closer. There's off, there's on, and then there's even a steering lock, which is all the way left. Now, this is a pretty cool system in a lot of ways, because as long as you have the key on you, you don't have to go futzing with it. But it does seem like a slightly over-engineered solution to a problem that doesn't really exist, and we'll talk about some of the crazy features now. There are a number of buttons on the key, and the two most interesting are these two up top. Now, this top button helps you find your little Honda if you lose it in a parking lot. So push the button, it beeps twice, the hazard flash, and then hopefully you'll be able to find your bike in a crowded parking lot. This bottom button, or I should say middle button, is a little bit interesting. This is for an alarm, so if I push it, it'll beep a couple times, and now the alarm is activated. And if I'm a thief who goes and tries to steal the little Honda, I push it off its stand, and it freaks out. How crazy is that? And then, if I let go, it shuts up. And then to disable the key, I simply push the button, and now the alarm is disabled. Here in the center of the Super Cub, you'll notice one large gauge, and it's partially digital and partially analog. So if I turn on the Honda, you can see it lights up, the needle does a little sweep, and then you have a couple of indicators here. So you actually have a fuel level. That's pretty cool. It's only a 1 gallon tank, but it does tell you the current capacity. You also have a gear indicator, so you can see neutral light, and then first, second, and third as I cruise up and down the gears. It's all confused because it's not on. You also have your odometer and a trip computer, along with the time, and just below that you have several warning lights, including check engine light and your brights. One of the unique things about the Super Cub has always been its large wheels, and this has been a trait of this little machine since the very beginning. These are 17-inch wheels, and what's great about them is they don't fall in all the tiny holes that a small scooter wheel would. You also notice a disc brake on the front with ABS. This has front wheel ABS. Moving up from there, you've got this classic front end with the horn located just beneath the C125 logo, and I love this very retro looking headlight, but it's actually full LED. Take a look. Now just behind the handlebars, you'll notice this large fairing here. That's also a nice retro touch with the classic Honda badge there. Of course, you've got a large foot peg down here, and then more vintage styling as we come across the side. One of the cooler aspects is this down here. This is a chain guard, and one of the original requirements of the Honda was that, it had to be easy to ride, had to be very approachable, and as such they hid a lot of the mechanics that make it go, including the chain. And then you'll notice the twin shock rear end with 3.6 inches of suspension travel. And finally, at the rear of the Honda, you notice a couple of other modern touches, including the full LED taillight, LED turn signals, and look at this, even a little LED light for your license plate. Unlike most scooters, the Super Cub has its engine positioned down here, kind of in the middle of the bike, in between the rider's legs, unlike most scooters, which have their engines positioned way back here by the rear wheel. Now, this is pretty cool because it has a nice low center of gravity, but the downside of this is you don't really have all that much under-seat storage. Take a look. Now, to get underneath the seat, there's a little tiny button here. You see that? It's actually an electric switch, and as long as the key is within its proximity sensor, I can actually pop the seat. And here we have a couple of interesting things. First of all, we have the fuel tank. It is a 1 gallon fuel tank, and there's a cap right here in the center. It has been like this for decades and decades on the Super Cub. Next up, we actually have this little hook right here. This is for a helmet. You see, I simply hook a helmet on right here. And now, if I close the seat and walk away, I can't actually access the helmet because the seat will lock in position if it senses that the key has left the bike. But there are a couple of other things underneath the seat. First of all, this little button right here, and when I push it, something cool happens. See, this is how you actually get to the toolkit. It lives right down here in this little pouch. It's it's incredibly minimal, I think would be a fair word for it. But really, a screwdriver and an Allen wrench is probably all you need to entirely rebuild the bike. So maybe it's not minimal, maybe it's extensive. But it does have this nice little cubby down here that it lives in with a little strap so it doesn't go wobbling around. And the other thing to note is there's a little cutout actually in the flap itself. That's where you can keep the owner's manual and your documents. Now the Honda does look very cool perched up here on its center stand. It's got this very regal look. That's great and all for parking it when you're showing it to your friends, but unfortunately, there's no small side stand where you can just lean it over. You have to put it up on the central stand every time you park the bike. Now that's not such a hard thing. Wet, it only weighs 240 pounds, but even still, if you're smaller and weaker than me, which is actually impossible, so maybe it's not such a problem, this can get old after a lot of different parking trips. Now there are a couple of issues with the vintage looking Honda. As cool as it is, there is really no storage on it whatsoever for groceries and the like, which is kind of a shame if you're putting around town on your scooter. Typically you can just lift up the seat and throw tons of stuff in it, not on the Super Cub. And then we get to the smart key. This is kind of a cool system, but if the battery dies on the scooter, you can't start it. Now to charge up the battery, you actually have to get under this cover. To get under this cover, you need a screwdriver. And to get to the screwdriver, you need electricity to pop the seat so that you can access the toolkit. But you can't pop the seat and access the toolkit unless you have charge in the battery, so it's more of like a chicken and the egg thing. So if you're at home, just make sure you have a screwdriver in case the battery dies. But apart from that, it's a really cool little bike. So there you have it, the Honda Super Cub. What a cool little scooter. Or is it a motorcycle? I'm kind of on the fence because the engine lives between your legs, but let's be honest, it doesn't live that far between your legs. So it's just such a cool vintage little bike. You can easily see why they sold over 100 million of them at an MSRP of about $3,600. It's a pretty cool little deal, especially if you're like me, just getting into motorcycles. Now, if you want to know what this bike rides like, be sure to stay tuned here because Case has a full ride review coming up soon. Well, as always, this has been Tommy. I'm typically on the car and truck channels, and that's probably a good thing because I'm much worse than Alex behind the camera, but stay tuned to TFL Bike because we've got a lot of coverage coming on everything bike related.